I thought he loved me. I really truly believed it. The way you believe the sun will rise tomorrow, the way you believe your own name when someone calls it. I thought he loved me until his brother kissed me first. And the worst part? That kiss didn't ruin everything. It revealed everything. It pulled back the curtain on a year of silence I'd been calling love, a year of loneliness I'd been calling patience, and a man I'd been calling mine, who never once truly held me. This is the story of how I spent 365 days loving someone who couldn't even remember how I take my coffee, and how his older brother handed me a beat-up paperback novel at a bookstore counter and quietly changed my entire life. If you've ever stayed too long with someone who made you feel invisible, if you've ever lain awake at night beside someone and still felt completely alone, then this one was written for you. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. My name is Mia Cavendish, and this is the truest thing I've ever said out loud. It started, or maybe it ended, in a hospital waiting room in Asheville, North Carolina, on a cold Tuesday night in early March. I was sitting in a plastic chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold about 40 minutes ago. The overhead lights were that sickly yellow color that makes everyone look like they haven't slept in a week. I hadn't slept much, so I suppose the lighting was being honest. My boyfriend, Weston Hale, had stepped outside to take a work call. His father had just been admitted after a minor stroke. Earl Hale, 67 years old, a retired contractor with rough hands and a soft voice, and Weston was in the parking lot talking to a client about load-bearing walls. I remember staring at the door he'd walked through and thinking, he'll be back in a minute, he just needs to handle this one thing. I was always thinking that. Just one more thing. Then he'll come back. Then he'll be present. The waiting room was nearly empty. Just me, an older woman knitting in the corner, and the low murmur of a television mounted on the wall playing the weather forecast for a week nobody cared about. Then the door opened, and a man walked in who looked like he'd driven through the night without stopping. He was tall, taller than Weston, with darker hair and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were rimmed with shadows, he had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and he stood in the doorway for a moment scanning the room like he was trying to figure out where to put himself. When his gaze landed on me, he paused. "You must be Mia," he said. Yes?" He walked over and sat down in the chair beside mine, dropped the duffel bag at his feet, exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 7 hours straight, which, as I'd later learn, was roughly the length of the drive from Savannah, Georgia to Asheville, and he'd done it without a single stop.
"How's he doing?" he asked quietly. "My dad." "Stable," I said. "The doctors said the next 48 hours are the most important, but they seem optimistic. He was responsive when they moved him to the room." He nodded slowly, pressed his palms together between his knees and stared at the floor. Then he turned to look at me, really look at me, and said something no one had said to me in a very long time. "And how are you doing?" 4 words, that's all it was. 4 ordinary words that most people say without thinking. But the way he said them, quiet, unhurried, like my answer actually mattered, made something crack inside my chest. "I'm fine," I whispered. He studied me for a moment. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they held this strange, steady warmth, like a candle behind frosted glass. "You don't have to be," he said softly. I almost cried right there. Under those ugly yellow lights, holding a cup of cold coffee, sitting next to a man I'd met 30 seconds ago, I almost broke down completely. His name was Noah Hale. He was Weston's older brother by 3 years, and he had just driven through the entire night to get to his father's bedside. And in the months that followed, he would do something far more terrifying than that. He would make me realize what love was actually supposed to feel like. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. About a year before that hospital waiting room, before the stroke, before Noah, before everything fell apart and then somehow fell together, I was 24 years old, managing a small independent bookstore on Lexington Avenue in downtown Asheville. The shop was called Inkwell and Ivy. It had creaky floors, tall shelves stuffed with secondhand paperbacks, and a little reading nook by the window where the afternoon sun came in just right. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Well, not mine exactly. I managed it for the owner, a retired English professor named Mrs. Arden, who lived in Savannah and trusted me to keep the place alive. I also spent most of my free time taking care of my mother. She'd been battling lupus for 3 years, the kind that comes and goes in flares, unpredictable and exhausting. Some weeks she was fine, almost herself again. Other weeks she could barely make it from the bed to the bathroom. I drove her to appointments, picked up her prescriptions, cooked meals she sometimes couldn't eat, and sat beside her on bad nights when the joint pain kept her awake. I wasn't unhappy, but I was tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones so deep you forget what rested feels like. Then one Saturday evening in March, exactly a year before Earl Hale's stroke, I went to a housewarming party that my college friend, Bryn Alford, threw at her new apartment. I almost didn't go. I'd been at the bookstore all day, my feet hurt, and I had a stack of invoices waiting at home. But Bryn had begged, and I figured one glass of wine and an hour of small talk wouldn't hurt. That's where I met Weston. He was leaning against the kitchen counter when I walked in, holding a bottle of craft beer and telling some story about architectural symmetry that somehow had 3 people laughing. He was handsome, sandy blonde hair pushed back from his forehead, a sharp jaw, and the kind of smile that made you feel like you were standing in a spotlight. When he noticed me hovering near the doorway, he excused himself from his audience and walked straight over. "You look like you're calculating exactly how long you have to stay before you can leave," he said. I laughed, really laughed, because that was exactly what I'd been doing. 45 minutes, I said, including the time it takes to find Bryn, say happy housewarming, and locate my car keys. He grinned. "Give me 20 of those minutes. If I can't convince you to stay longer, I'll walk you to your car myself." 20 minutes turned into 2 hours. He told me he was an architect at a small firm downtown. He sketched buildings on cocktail napkins and explained how natural light moved through open spaces. He ordered dessert at every restaurant because life is too short to skip the sweet parts. And at the end of the night, standing next to my car in the cool mountain air, he looked at me and said, "You have the most honest eyes I've ever seen." Nobody had ever called my eyes honest before. Most people just said they were brown. We started dating that same week, and for the first 3 months, it felt like breathing, easy, natural, right. He took me to a little Italian restaurant on Haywood Road and drew the building's facade on a napkin while we waited for pasta. He surprised me with sunflowers because I'd mentioned once that I liked them better than roses. He texted me good morning every single day and called me Cavendish like it was his favorite word. I was falling fast.
But here's the thing about falling. You don't notice the ground rushing toward you until you hit it. Around month 4, the texts got shorter, then slower. Then sometimes they didn't come at all, and when I'd finally hear from him 8 hours later, there was no apology, no explanation. Just a, "hey," dropped casually into the conversation like he hadn't been missing all day. I mentioned my mother's upcoming doctor's appointment, a big one, a specialist in Raleigh we'd been waiting 3 months to see. He nodded, said, "Hope it goes well," changed the subject to a project at work. I mentioned it again the day before the appointment. He said, "Oh, right, that's tomorrow?" Like I'd told him about a dentist cleaning. He didn't call to ask how it went. I made excuses. He's stressed about a deadline. He's not great with medical stuff. Some people show love differently. By month 6, I was fluent in a language I never wanted to learn, the language of excuses. He forgot our dinner because he was overwhelmed at work. He didn't come to my mother's birthday dinner because he had a migraine. He didn't say, "I love you" back one night because he was half asleep. Some people aren't good at emotional conversations, I told myself. That doesn't make them bad. I repeated it like a prayer, over and over, lying awake at 3 a.m. while he slept soundly beside me, his phone face down on the nightstand, and I wondered, not for the first time, why I could be lying right next to someone and feel so completely, devastatingly alone. Fast forward to that March night, 11 months into our relationship. Earl Hale, Weston's father, collapsed in his kitchen while making a sandwich. His wife, Cordelia, found him on the floor, conscious but unable to move his left arm. She called 911. The ambulance took him to Mission Hospital in Asheville. Minor stroke, treatable, but serious. Cordelia called Weston. Weston called me, not because he needed comfort, he called because he needed a ride. His car was in the shop. I picked him up in 12 minutes, still wearing my bookstore apron. At the hospital, Weston was fine. That's the only word for it. Not distraught, not panicked, not even particularly worried. Just fine. He talked to the doctor, nodded at the right moments, then stepped outside to return a work email. Then another work email, then a phone call. I sat in that waiting room for almost 2 hours, mostly alone, before Noah walked through the door. 7 hours. He'd driven 7 hours through the night, from Savannah, where he worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center, without stopping. He didn't call ahead to ask if it was serious enough to come. He didn't weigh his options. His father was in a hospital. He got in his car and drove. After our brief conversation, after those 4 words, "How are you doing?" Noah went straight to his father's room. I watched him through the little window in the door. He pulled a chair right up to the bedside, took his father's hand, and just sat there. Didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, just held his dad's hand and talked to him softly. Weston came back inside about 20 minutes later, coffee in hand, and glanced toward the room. "Sullivan's here," he said. He still called his brother by their childhood surname habit sometimes, which I only learned later. "Noah," I corrected gently. "Yeah, he drove from Savannah." "Of course he did," Weston said. Not warmly, more like predictably. That should have told me everything, but I was still fluent in excuses. Over the following weeks, Noah stayed at his parents' house to help with Earl's recovery. He'd moved into his old bedroom, the one still painted navy blue from high school, and reorganized his entire life around his father's rehabilitation. Physical therapy exercises every morning, walks down the hallway, slow and patient, homemade meals because Earl's doctor wanted him on a low-sodium diet, and Noah actually learned how to cook without salt and still make food taste good. He made a chicken soup from scratch one afternoon that Earl said was the best thing I've eaten in 40 years, and Cordelia pretended to be offended, and everyone laughed, and it was the warmest sound I'd heard in that house. I started coming by after work, not because anyone asked me to. No one did. Cordelia barely acknowledged me most days. A curt nod, a thin-lipped hello. She'd never approved of me, and she made no effort to pretend otherwise. But I came anyway. I brought groceries, I sat with Earl and listened to his fishing stories, long, winding tales about largemouth bass in the French Broad River that may or may not have been exaggerated by about 300%. He told them with such joy that it didn't matter. And Noah noticed, not the way you notice a lamp in a room, present but unremarkable. He noticed the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter, like it meant something.
He asked about my mother, not once, repeatedly. He asked about her medication, her flare-ups, whether she was sleeping. He asked about the bookstore, how sales were, what new inventory I'd ordered, whether the heating system was still giving me trouble. He asked what I liked to read, and he remembered every single answer. Meanwhile, Weston came by the house maybe twice a week, stayed for an hour, sat in the living room scrolling through his phone while his father napped in the next room. Then he'd leave, kissing my forehead on the way out like he was checking a box. One evening, I tried to talk to him about it. "Don't you think you should come by more?" I asked carefully. "Your dad's still pretty weak." He shrugged. "Noah's got it covered. He's built for that kind of thing." "Built for what kind of thing?" "The caretaker stuff, the emotional heavy lifting. That's always been his role." I stared at him. "You're not built like what?" I thought. Like someone who shows up? Like someone who cares? But I didn't say it. I never said those things out loud. I just swallowed and smiled. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-April when Noah walked into Inkwell and Ivy. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up from behind the counter where I was sorting a box of used paperbacks that a customer had donated. Noah stood in the doorway, wearing a gray Henley and jeans, and he had this slightly nervous expression, like a kid about to give a presentation he'd been rehearsing. "I found something," he said. He walked up to the counter and placed a book on the surface between us. It was a used copy of East of Eden by John Steinbeck, dog-eared, creased spine, a coffee ring on the back cover. "You mentioned once that this was your favorite," he said, "and that your old copy fell apart." I stared at the book, then at him. "Where did you find this?" "Little thrift store on Merriman Avenue. It was sitting on a shelf between a cookbook and a romance novel with a pirate on the cover." I laughed, and then my throat tightened because I realized something that hit me harder than it should have. I had mentioned East of Eden exactly one time, weeks ago, in passing, during a conversation about books that lasted maybe 5 minutes. He remembered. He went looking, and he found it. Weston and I had been together for nearly a year, and he still didn't know my favorite book. He didn't know my favorite anything. I once told him my favorite flower was a sunflower, and the following Valentine's Day he bought me red roses, not because he was being thoughtful in a different way, because he'd forgotten. Weston handed me a $3 used book from a thrift store, and it meant more than every bouquet Weston had ever half-heartedly ordered. "Thank you," I said. My voice cracked a little, and I hoped he didn't notice. He noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't make a big deal of it. He just smiled, that quiet, steady smile of his, and changed the subject. "So, do you need help with anything around here? I've got a free afternoon." I put him to work organizing the fiction section. Within 20 minutes, he knocked over an entire display of staff picks, hardcovers crashing onto the floor like dominoes, and stood there in the middle of the wreckage looking so horrified that I bent over laughing until my ribs ached. "I am so sorry," he said, scrambling to pick them up. I'll fix it. I'll fix all of it. Please don't," I wheezed. "You'll bring down the whole wall." He started laughing too, and there we were, the two of us, on our knees on the creaky bookstore floor, surrounded by fallen novels, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. I don't remember the last time I'd laughed like that. That evening, driving home, I caught myself smiling. And then, just as quickly, I caught myself feeling guilty about it. Not because I'd done anything wrong. Nothing had happened. Nothing at all. But something was shifting. I could feel it, like tectonic plates moving beneath a surface that still looked calm. It was a Thursday evening in late April. I remember the exact color of the sky. Deep violet, almost bruised. That shade it turns right before full dark. The air was thick with honeysuckle. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing an acoustic guitar, and the notes drifted over the yard like something from a dream. I was sitting on the back porch of the Hale house. Earl had gone to bed early. Cordelia was inside watching a rerun of something she'd already seen twice, and Weston,
Weston was supposed to come for dinner. He'd texted an hour before. "Swamped at the office. Go without me." 5 words. No apology. No, "save me a plate." Not even a period at the end. Just a sentence fragment tossed into the void. I'd set a place for him at the table. Noah had noticed. He hadn't said anything, but when he cleared the dishes, he quietly removed the unused plate and silverware without comment. That small gesture, the gentleness of it, the lack of judgment, made my chest ache. Now we sat on the porch, side by side, in 2 old wooden rocking chairs that Earl had built himself 20 years ago. The paint was peeling, the joints creaked with every shift of weight, but they were sturdy, built to last. We were quiet for a while. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, not the kind I'd grown used to with Weston, where silence felt like distance. This was the kind of quiet that feels like its own language, the kind where you don't need to fill the space because the space itself feels full. Then Noah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared out at the darkening yard. "Can I tell you something, Mia?" "Sure." He was quiet for another moment, gathering something. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, thicker. "I've been watching you these past few weeks, and I don't mean it in a strange way. I just mean I've noticed things." He paused. "I've noticed the way you show up, every day, after working a full shift, after checking on your mother, after everything you carry. You come here, you sit with my dad and listen to his fishing stories like they're the most important thing in the world. You bring groceries and act like it's nothing. You reorganized his pill bottles by day and time because you noticed my mom kept getting confused." My hands were trembling. I pressed them flat against my thighs. "You love so hard, Mia. You love so hard it's almost painful to watch. Because I've also watched my brother take every single bit of it for granted, every single day." A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it, then another. Noah turned to face me. His eyes were glassy. "You deserve someone who sees you, not someone who keeps you around because you're convenient, not someone who cancels on dinner and doesn't even have the decency to sound sorry about it." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because he had just said, out loud, in plain words, the thing I'd been too terrified to admit to myself for over a year. I was convenient. That's all I was to Weston. A warm body in the passenger seat, a name in his phone, someone to set a place for at the table and then forget about. Noah reached over slowly and brushed the tear from my cheek with his thumb. His hand was warm. And then, carefully, gently, like he was giving me every possible chance to pull away, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, and it shattered every wall I'd spent a year building. Not because it was wrong, not because it was some forbidden, scandalous thing. It broke me open because it was the first time in so long, that I felt genuinely, unmistakably wanted, not tolerated, not overlooked, not loved out of habit. Wanted. I pulled back, and we just looked at each other. He didn't apologize. He didn't scramble to explain or take it back. He just held my gaze with those steady, pale blue eyes, and I saw something in them that I hadn't seen in Weston's eyes in months. Maybe ever. Tenderness. I drove home that night in a fog, pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there. For 45 minutes, I sat in my car in the dark, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what I felt. Guilt, relief, grief,
hope. All of it tangled together like a knot I couldn't undo. Then I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the second ring. It was almost 10 o'clock, but she answered like she'd been waiting. "Mom," I said. That's all I got out before I started sobbing. Deep, gulping sobs that came from somewhere below my lungs, somewhere I'd been locking everything away for 12 months. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say, "What's wrong?" or "Calm down," or "Tell me everything." She just said, quietly, with the kind of knowing that only mothers carry, "Baby, I've been waiting for you to hear your own heart." And I cried harder, because she knew. All this time, she knew. I broke up with Weston 3 days later. It was a Sunday morning. I drove to his apartment. He opened the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, holding a bowl of cereal, looking at me like I'd interrupted something, though I'm not sure what. "We need to talk," I said. He leaned against the doorframe. "Okay." "I can't do this anymore, Weston." He chewed slowly, swallowed, nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I figured this was coming." That was it. No why, no can we work on it, no what happened, no please don't go. Just I figured this was coming. Like a package he'd been expecting, like a weather forecast he'd already checked. He didn't even put the cereal bowl down. I stood there for a moment, waiting, for what I don't even know, some flicker of something. Sadness, anger, regret, anything. He took another bite, glanced at his phone on the counter behind him. A full year of my life, 12 months of showing up, of trying, of making myself smaller and quieter and easier to love, and he couldn't even look up from his screen to watch it end. "Goodbye, Weston," I said. "See ya," he replied. I walked back to my car and sat there again. But this time, I didn't cry. I just felt empty. Like a room after the furniture's been moved out. Bare walls. Echoes. I didn't go to Noah. That needs to be said clearly, because this story isn't about jumping from one man to another. It was never about that. I called Noah that evening and told him I'd ended things with Weston, and before he could respond, I said, "I need time." There was a pause. Then he said, "Take all the time you need, Mia. I'm not going anywhere." And I believed him, because everything Noah Hale had ever said to me, every single word, had been true. The next 3 months were mine. I cried a lot, more than I expected. Not over Weston, exactly, but over what I'd allowed, over the version of myself I'd become, the one who swallowed her needs and called it love, who confused presence with partnership, who mistook silence for peace. I journaled, pages and pages in a notebook I kept on my nightstand. I wrote letters to myself I never sent. I rearranged the bookstore. I spent more time with my mother, sitting on her porch on good days, rubbing her swollen joints on bad ones, cooking dinner together when she had the energy. "You look different," she told me one afternoon in June. "Different how?" She smiled, like someone who finally stopped holding her breath. It was a warm August evening when I drove back to the Hale house. The porch looked the same, the rocking chairs were still there, peeling paint, creaky joints, sturdy as ever. The honeysuckle was in full bloom, and the air smelled so sweet it almost hurt. Earl was doing well. He'd regained most of his mobility, was back to telling fishing stories at full volume, and had started a slow daily walk around the neighborhood with Cordelia holding his arm. Cordelia herself had softened toward me, just slightly. A warmer hello, a cup of tea offered without being asked. Small things, but I noticed. Noah was sitting on the porch when I pulled into the driveway. He had a paperback in one hand and a mug in the other, and when he saw me, he set both down and stood up. He didn't rush toward me, didn't sweep me off my feet, didn't say anything grand or dramatic. He just stood there in the porch light, looking at me with those quiet, steady eyes, and waited. 3 months. He'd waited 3 months. No pressure, no dramatic texts, no ultimatums or guilt, just patience, just presence, just a man who said, "I'm not going anywhere," and actually meant it. I walked up the porch steps, sat down in the rocking chair beside his, listened to the crickets and the distant hum of the neighborhood settling into evening, and then I reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm, certain, unhesitating, and he let out this breath, this long, quiet exhale, like he'd been holding it for months, maybe longer. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a while. We didn't need to. Everything that needed saying had already been said, in a thrift store book, in a fallen display of novels, in 4 words in a hospital waiting room. And how are you? I grew up believing love was supposed to feel like a slow exhale, like finally breathing after holding everything in for too long. I spent a year holding my breath with a man who never noticed I was suffocating. And then his brother, quiet, steady, patient Noah, taught me it was okay to let go. Not with grand gestures, not with fireworks or promises, but with a cup of tea brought without asking, with a name remembered, with a used book placed on a counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes the love that saves you doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives in the silence after the storm, soft, unhurried, and sure. And when it does, you'll know, because for the first time in longer than you can remember, you'll breathe. And that's where I'll leave this story tonight. If this reached something inside you, if it reminded you of someone you stayed too long for, or someone who finally made you feel seen, leave a comment below. Tell me your story, because I promise you, someone watching right now needs to hear it just as much as you needed to hear mine. And if you're not already part of the Soul Tales family, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories here that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. I'll see you in the next one.